A mail-order groom arrived bound in chains. The virgin bride cut them herself. The train pulled into Carrion Hollow just before dusk, its black iron frame sighing steam into the blue air as a cluster of townspeople gathered by the platform, all drawn by the promise of a spectacle. A mail-order groom, they'd heard, not just any drifter or poor hand, but a man arriving in chains, wrists bound, flanked by two deputies who looked like they'd rather not be there. The sheriff watched from a distance, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Miss Cora Bell stood apart from the rest. 19, small, and wearing her mother's old wedding dress, stiff at the collar and yellowed at the hem. Her hands didn't fidget, but her lip bore the faintest tremble. The man they brought down from the train was tall and unshaven, sun-darkened and quiet, with a rope around his waist and a lock on his wrists. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. When asked his name, he only said, "That ain't mine anymore." Someone laughed cruelly, another spit near his boot. "That your husband, Miss Bell?" someone called out. She didn't answer. The preacher cleared his throat but offered no sermon. It was meant to be a wedding. Instead, it was a transfer. Cora walked forward, eyes level with the man's collarbone. She didn't reach for him. She didn't touch the chain. She simply nodded once to the deputies, then turned and walked away, toward the wagon hitched just outside town. They pushed him forward. His boots dragged like he hadn't decided to follow. But he did. No one said anything until they'd gone. Then the whispers began. A chained man? In her house? Doesn't even talk. Might be cursed. What man lets a girl walk ahead like that? But Cora didn't look back. Her house was 2 miles out, and she didn't offer him reins or water. She just walked, and he followed, every clink of the chain like a reminder that this wasn't a marriage. Not yet. Maybe never. The cabin was plain and clean, with a half-repaired roof and wildflowers growing up the steps like they had claimed the place for themselves. Inside, the fire hadn't been lit in 2 days, and the bread on the table had started to stale. Cora stepped in first, removed her boots, and tied her hair up without a word. She didn't offer him a seat or food. The man stood just inside the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, the weight of the chains dragging across her wooden floor. She walked past him, opened the cupboard, and pulled out a small kitchen knife. Not the kind used for defense, but the kind her mother used to slice berries for pie. She approached him with it. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask. He just looked down at her hands as she raised the knife to the leather strap that held his wrists together. It was a poor man's restraint, tight but crude, soaked from the train's sweat and weather. She held the strap, then paused. "What did you do?" she asked, voice level. "Does it matter?" he said. It wasn't cruel, just quiet. She considered that, then looked down again. I guess not. The blade slipped under the strap and tugged once, twice. It wouldn't cut easily. She tried harder, her breath caught. Then finally it gave. The leather snapped apart. He didn't move. She stepped back. "There's water in the basin. I won't watch." Then she turned and went outside to chop kindling. When she returned an hour later, the fire was lit, the cabin warmer, and the chains placed neatly on the table. He sat on the floor by the wall, not the chair. His shirt was damp from washing, and he smelled like lye soap and cedar. He hadn't run. He hadn't tried to touch her. He just nodded once when she looked at him. She didn't nod back. Instead, she said, "You'll sleep by the hearth." And he did. Cora rose before dawn out of habit, the same way she always had, before her father's voice, before the hens stirred, before her own thoughts caught up to her. The cabin was quiet, except for the low, steady breath of someone sleeping. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the main room, expecting an empty hearth. But he was still there. Curled under the rough wool blanket she'd left by the fire, one arm tucked beneath his head, the other stretched outward like he hadn't meant to fall asleep at all. His boots were off, his shirt half dry on a peg, and the chains sat untouched where she had left them. That mattered. Not just because he hadn't fled, but because he hadn't tried to make himself part of anything either. He hadn't taken the bed, hadn't asked questions, hadn't even looked through her things. Just slept like a man who hadn't known rest in years. She moved quietly toward the stove and struck a match. The smell of kindling rising in warm puffs brought life back into the room, and with it, him. He stirred but didn't rise, just watched her from beneath the blanket. "You always wake this early?" he asked. She didn't answer. She poured water into the pot, added oats, and waited. When the silence stretched too long, he sat up. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "Good," she replied, "because I've had enough of it." He didn't ask what she meant. He looked down at his hands instead, scraped, calloused, the leather marks still red around his wrists. She noticed them too. "You can wash with the rest of the lie if you need," she said, still not facing him. "Thank you." He stood slowly, stiff from the floor. "What do I call you?" She hesitated. "Cora," he nodded. "Reed." She finally turned. "That your real name?" "As real as I've got." She looked him in the eye then, long enough to see there wasn't a lie in it, or maybe just one he was willing to keep. The oats boiled, the day began, and for the first time since she'd opened the letter calling him here, she didn't feel like she'd made a mistake. Not yet. Later that afternoon, as the wind picked up and the sky turned pale with clouds, Cora found him behind the shed splitting wood. Not for show, not for favor, just because it needed doing. He hadn't asked, and she hadn't told him. But the pile beside the stump had grown tall and neat, and his shirt hung from a branch, damp with sweat. She stepped out with a dipper of water and paused when she saw his back. A jagged scar ran down his spine, wide and healed badly, like it had come from a blade too dull or a punishment too personal. He noticed her looking but said nothing, just pulled the axe high again and brought it down clean. "That one hurt?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the mark. "Only when it rains," he said, not turning around. She walked closer and set the water on a stump beside him. "My father used to say a man with a scar is a man who survived something worth remembering." "Your father give you that rifle too?" She nodded. "And the land. And the reason to stay angry at most men." Reed wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. "You can stay angry at me, if it helps. I'm used to that kind of silence." She tilted her head. "I don't want silence. I want truth." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't look away quickly. "Truth is, I was supposed to die in prison. They let me out because some broker said a bride needed a husband more than a judge needed justice." "And you came?" "I figured whoever wrote the letter might be the kind of woman who knew what being trapped felt like." Cora folded her arms. "Didn't expect her to be young? Didn't expect her to be kind?" That word, kind, made her flinch. Not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't how anyone had described her in years. Not since her mother passed. Not since she stopped speaking to the preacher. She stepped back slowly. "I don't trust words, Reed." He nodded. "Then I'll keep mine few." And he did. He didn't ask for anything else. Just finished the stack, put his shirt back on, and walked back to the porch with the same quiet presence that unnerved her more than shouting ever had. The rain began just before supper, a soft tapping on the roof that filled the kitchen with a hush Cora had never minded. She stood at the stove, stirring beans in a cast-iron pot, trying not to overthink how still the house felt with a man in it. Reed sat at the far table, repairing the boot he'd come with, stitching quietly, his fingers careful and precise. She didn't ask why he hadn't eaten yet, hadn't offered. It felt safer that way. But when she reached for the skillet and caught her thumb on the iron, the burn seared through her hand, and she hissed, recoiling sharply. The wooden spoon clattered to the floor. Reed stood up fast, his chair scraping loud on the floorboards, but he didn't cross to her. He stopped 3 feet away, hands open at his sides like a man who'd once reached too fast and paid for it. "Let me see," he said softly. She cradled her hand and shook her head. "It's fine." "I believe you," he said, not moving closer. "Still hurts, though." She didn't respond, just turned her back and ran cold water over it, jaw clenched. Behind her he waited, not with pressure, not with pity, just with presence. When she turned around again, he had placed a cloth on the counter and stepped back, giving her room. She took it slowly, eyes scanning his face. "You didn't reach for me. Didn't want to scare you. Most men think pain's a reason to touch." Reed looked down at his hands. "That's the trouble. Pain's not permission." That silence between them changed shape then. Not empty anymore, just full of something unspoken that didn't threaten, only settled. Cora pressed the cloth to her thumb and said, "You hungry?" He nodded once. She handed him a tin plate and let him scoop for himself. No one had done that for him in years, and she saw it in the way he moved, measured, slow, almost like he expected her to snatch it back. But she didn't. She sat across from him with her own food, bandaged hand in her lap, and they ate without a word. The rain thickened outside, turning the windows foggy and dim. "I don't know what they told you," she said finally. "About me." Reed chewed, swallowed. "Only that you needed someone." "That's what they told you. What do you see?" He looked at her for a long time. "A woman who knows her own fire, and burns herself anyway." She wanted to scoff, maybe laugh, but instead she said, "You gonna fix that roof tomorrow?" He nodded. "And the shed door. Then maybe I'll let you stay another night." He didn't smile. But he didn't look surprised either. Just picked up his plate and washed it without asking. Lightning split the sky that night, casting quick white veins across the rafters of the little cabin. Reed sat on the floor near the hearth, sharpening his knife slowly, while Cora stared out the small window, watching the rain pound the earth into mud. The candle between them flickered with each gust of wind, throwing their shadows against opposite walls. She hadn't lit a second one. One flame was enough for 2 people who barely spoke. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, and the chill from the storm crept up her arms. But she didn't move. Reed noticed. He always noticed. Still, he didn't offer to warm her. He didn't reach or speak. He just took the small blanket folded near his pack, stood, and walked past her toward the door. Not close enough to make her flinch, just enough to lay it gently over the chair beside her. Then he sat back down. Cora watched him, her fingers twitching near the window's latch. "Why didn't you take the bed?" she asked. "You fixed it. You earned it." He didn't answer for a moment. "I'm used to the floor." "That doesn't mean you like it." "I don't need to like everything I deserve." That stopped her. She turned fully toward him now, her voice low. "Is that how you lived before?" Reed didn't nod, didn't confirm, just said, "Some men take what's offered. Some wait too long, and it stops being theirs to want. And which one are you? Another gust hit the window. The candle guttered. Reed looked at her through the flickering light. I don't think that's up to me. Cora felt her throat tighten, not with fear this time, but with something far more dangerous. Trust. She stepped away from the window and sat near the hearth. Not beside him, but closer than before. The silence stretched. Reed put down the knife. He didn't move his hand, didn't test the distance, didn't shift his body. And that stillness was the kindest thing he'd done yet. They sat like that for nearly an hour, shadows long and breaths steady, until the storm dulled to a heavy drizzle and the wind forgot its rage. Why'd you come? She asked. I didn't choose you. You were sent. True, he said. But I stayed. You could have run. I've had enough of running. Cora looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not just a man bound by chains, but someone who'd learned not to grip too tightly even after being freed. She stood and walked toward the bedroom. At the doorframe, she paused. The bed's warm. Still not an invitation, just information. And she left the door open behind her. The morning came with a strange quiet. No bird song, no wind, just the hush of heavy clouds threatening more rain. Reed rose early, his boots muffled by the damp earth as he stepped out into the yard. He saw it immediately. The barn door was ajar. He moved toward it with the slow surety of a man who knew sorrow didn't like to be startled. Inside, the light was faint and gray, filtering through the slats like a secret. Cora stood near the far stall, her back to him, shoulders trembling. She held something in her hand. Her father's hat, worn at the brim, stiff with dried sweat and memory. Reed didn't say her name. He didn't clear his throat. He simply stepped to the wall, unhooked the coil of rope, and began tying a loop, the kind used to pull heavy hay or fix a slipping gate. The sound of rope against leather was soft but steady. Something to hold on to. Cora turned, her eyes red. I don't even know why I came out here, she whispered. Nothing's broken. Doesn't have to be, Reed said, knotting the end. Sometimes barns are the only place big enough to hold it all. She looked down at the hat in her hands. He never came in here when he drank, said the animals deserved better. Reed didn't offer comfort. He offered motion. He walked to the middle beam and began rigging a pulley to lift the feed bag that had collapsed last week. It didn't need fixing yet, but it gave them something to do. After a moment, Cora stepped beside him and held the rope while he tied the knot. Their hands brushed once. Neither pulled away. Why are you kind? She asked softly. Even when I'm not. Kindness isn't a trade, he said. It's a way of staying human. You've had a lot of people forget you were. He nodded. That's why I don't forget others. They worked in silence until the rope held firm. The feed bag lifted, swung slightly, then stilled. Cora wiped her face with her sleeve, the hat still in her other hand. Do you think I'm weak? She asked. No, Reed said without pause. I think you're tired. I'm brave enough to admit it. She stared at him. My mother used to cry in the barn, said it was the one place the wind didn't judge. She was right. Reed took the rope down, handed her the loose coil. Put this back for tomorrow. You'll probably need it again. Life doesn't stop just because we break for a minute. She took it, the weight of it grounding her more than any word could. When she turned to hang it back on the wall, he walked out, not watching her, not waiting for thanks. And in the silence that followed, Cora didn't feel alone. It started with a wagon on the ridge, then 2 riders below it, and soon a cluster of men moving toward the homestead with the certainty of those who believed justice wore their face. The storm clouds broke overhead, not with thunder, but with a cruel kind of light, the kind that made every nail and memory shine. Reed stood in the yard, unarmed, one hand at his side, the other brushing the splinters of the post he'd been mending. He didn't move when they came closer, but his jaw set. Cora saw it from the porch. She recognized the lead man, the banker from West Hollow who'd lost his nephew in a card game Reed never played. "There he is," the banker barked, pointing at Reed like naming a thief. "Took a woman that don't belong, set foot where his kind's not welcome, and carries a sentence in every step." Reed didn't answer. He'd heard worse, and from better men. Cora stepped off the porch slowly. She wasn't in a dress, just her work clothes and an apron still dusted with flour. But she didn't walk like someone afraid. She walked like someone who had seen a man tie a rope with gentleness, who had cried in his presence without shame, who had felt him kneel beside her pain without trying to fix it. "You want him," she said, loud enough for the wind to carry. "You take me first." The men hesitated. The banker laughed dry. "Girl, you don't even know who he is." "I know exactly who he is," she said. "He's the man who fed the dog before himself, who fixed a stranger's roof without asking what it paid, who never asked what I owed, only what I wanted." Murmurs stirred. One of the younger men shifted his weight, suddenly unsure. The banker scowled. "You'll regret standing for him." "Then I'll regret it with clean hands and a full heart," she replied. Reed hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on her back, as if her words were a fire he couldn't look away from. "You think love makes him innocent?" the banker spat. Cora shook her head. "No, but it makes him worth forgiving." The words landed like stone on still water. The crowd didn't scatter, but they didn't advance either. And when Reed finally stepped forward, it wasn't to hide behind her, but to stand beside her, his hand resting gently at her elbow, not as a claim, but as a vow. "She shouldn't have to shield me," he said, "but I'm glad she did." The banker looked at the others, waiting for someone to shout, to move, to believe in the story he came to tell. But all he found were men staring at a woman who didn't tremble. And a man who didn't flinch. One by one, they turned their horses and left. Not because Reed proved them wrong, but because Cora made them question if they'd ever been right. That night, after the mob had left and the dust had settled, Reed didn't speak much. He stacked the last of the firewood, fixed the crooked hinge on the barn door, and washed his hands at the pump without glancing toward the house. Cora watched him from the kitchen window, arms wrapped around herself, not because she was cold, but because silence could be the loudest sound in the world. When supper was ready, she set 2 plates down and waited. But he didn't come in. He was in the lean-to beside the barn again, the same place she'd found him that first week, rolled in a blanket like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. She lit a lantern and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the stars scattered wide, but the ground was still damp from the afternoon's threat of rain. She didn't call his name. She just walked straight to him and stood by his side. "You're not sleeping here," she said softly. He kept his gaze on the dirt. "I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." She knelt beside him, resting the lantern on the ground so its light climbed slowly up his face. "You think after what I said in front of those men, I'd let you sleep in the dark again?" He didn't answer right away, but his shoulders shifted like something heavy had just been let go. "Cora, there are still things I haven't told you." She smiled, sad and certain. "You think I haven't guessed? You think I need your whole history in order to see who you are now?" She reached for his hand. Not to pull him, just to hold it. You didn't choose your chains, Reed, but you chose how to stand in them. His throat worked hard around no words. Come inside, she said, rising. If you try to sleep out here again, I'll just come sit with you every night until your pride catches cold. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. When he finally stood, he didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He just followed her through the dark, past the fence he'd rebuilt, up the steps he'd repaired, into the house he hadn't dared enter fully until now. She handed him a folded quilt. You can take the bed, he offered. Not tonight, she replied, walking past him toward the parlor. I'm sitting by the fire, and you're sitting beside me. He nodded, his voice low. You always this bossy? Only with the men I trust, she said. And when they sat by the fire, no words came for a while, just warmth, and the quiet flicker of two people who had nothing left to hide. The next morning, the sun came through the cabin windows like it finally belonged there. No fog, no storm, no shadows, just morning, warm and ordinary and whole. Cora tied her apron the way she always had, sleeves rolled high, hair pinned back. But she wasn't alone at the stove. Reed stood beside her, barefoot, shirt slightly wrinkled, holding a tin bowl with peeled potatoes in it like it was the most sacred thing he'd ever touched. You're cutting those too thick, she said without turning. Am I? He muttered, grinning. I thought I was helping. You are, she said, bumping his hip with hers. But we're not feeding mules. Try again. He didn't argue, just adjusted his grip and started over. She stirred the gravy. He set the biscuits. It was the first breakfast they made together. And the first morning she didn't feel like she had to do everything just to prove she was worth something. There was no one else there, no mob, no judge, no mail-order office expecting reports of whether their little experiment had succeeded. Just two people making food. Halfway through, the sound of hooves came up the drive. Cora stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, ready for trouble out of old habit. But it wasn't trouble. It was a wagon from town. Two older women and a boy holding flowers. They climbed down awkwardly. We heard what you did for him, one of the women said, eyes flicking toward Reed through the window. He might have come in chains, but he left the town different. The boy walked forward, handed her the flowers without a word, then looked back at the women. Mama says it's time people stop acting like women who can cook and shoot don't deserve the whole world. Cora smiled, blinked too fast. Tell your mama she's late to breakfast, but welcome anyway. That evening, Reed brought in a bundle of wood, only to find her already lighting the stove again. We're feeding half the town now? He asked. She nodded. If they're hungry and willing to listen, yes. And if they're not, then I'll cook louder. He watched her for a while, then stepped behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. I never thought I'd end up here, he whispered. Chained, broken, chosen. She leaned back into him, steady as the floor beneath them. I didn't think I'd choose anyone either, she said. But you didn't just come to me. You stayed. That night, the fire burned warm. The plates were full. And Cora didn't lift a single pot alone. Reed handed her the salt, wiped her hands with a towel, even kissed her temple when he thought no one saw. And for the first time since she was 16, and her daddy told her love was just another word for labor. Cora believed he was wrong. Because this didn't feel like labor. It felt like rest. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a mother and her twins sleeping on a bench, would you have stopped like the cowboy did or walked on? Tell us in the comments.